Do the Gospels contain legend and myth? It's commonly claimed by Christian apologists that the Gospels do not participate in the practice of myth-making or legendary development because of how little removed in both time and tradition the Gospels are from the events they record. In this video, we'll see why this claim is dubious. Legends can indeed take hold overnight, even among eyewitnesses, and contrary to Christian apologists, it's incredibly likely that the gospel narratives fell victim to legendary distortion and have been tainted by the likes of fiction. In the world of antiquity, where the boundaries between fact and fable were often blurred, legends and myths permeated nearly every form of written expression, from epic poetry to historical chronicles. From Herodotus' story of giant ants that dig for gold, to Josephus' relaying an omen of a cow giving birth to a lamb in the Jewish temple, legends were ubiquitous in the ancient world. The Gospels, written mediums firmly embedded in this ancient cultural milieu of the legendary and the fantastic, seem to fall victim to the same anthropological tendencies. In the Gospels, we see tales of virgin births, transfiguration, fantastic healings, exorcisms involving thousands of demons at once, and a plethora of resurrections. One such story involving the resurrection of a multitude of holy saints in unison. What precisely are we to make of these stories? Are we to believe that, despite the culture of legend and myth that we find the Gospels surrounded by, they are, contrary to their contemporaries, sober historical narratives through and through? Is, for instance, the miraculous conception of Alexander the Great merely a run-of-the-mill legend told of a great military leader, while the miraculous conception of Jesus is authentic narrative? Is Romulus's ascension to heaven clearly a tall tale, while Jesus' ascension to heaven is plain historical fact? Would not such claims epitomize special pleading? Don't these stories in the Gospels reek of standard legend as they would be viewed in any other work in antiquity? Christian apologists would challenge this notion. While the Gospel narratives might, upon first glance, share certain characteristics with the legends of their time, a closer look reveals a startling difference. That difference is, some apologists would claim, predicated on the fact that legends don't grow overnight. A legendary development of the birth of Alexander the Great makes sense because Plutarch, who records this event, wrote around 4 centuries after the life of Alexander. This leaves plenty of time for the roots of legend to take hold. But the Gospels are not susceptible to this issue, as they come within a time span of approximately 30 to 70 years after the events they record. The question then becomes, how quickly can legend develop, especially legend that will sufficiently infect the historical? Is a generation too short for the truth to become muddied in the waters of fiction? Many Christian apologists believe so, William Lane Craig being among them. In a multitude of debates, as well as in Craig's written work, he has claimed the following.
According to A.N. Sherwin-White in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, even 2 generations is too short a time span to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts.
This claim of Craig's has become well known in Christian apologetics. In fact, in the famous story of investigative journalist Lee Strobel, the skeptic turned Christian, it was his interview with Craig on this matter specifically that clinched his belief in the deity of Jesus. As Strobel states in The Case for Christ, I had wanted to believe that the deification of Jesus was the result of legendary development in which well-meaning but misguided people slowly turned a wise sage into the mythical Son of God. But while I went into my investigation thinking that this legendary explanation was intuitively obvious, I emerged convinced it was totally without basis. What clinched it for me was the famous study by A.N. Sherwin-White, the great classical historian from Oxford University, which William Lane Craig alluded to in our interview. Sherwin-White meticulously examined the rate at which legend accrued in the ancient world. His conclusion? Not even 2 full generations was enough time for legend to develop and to wipe out a solid core of historical truth. There are countless more apologists that use A. N. Sherwin White's two generations argument as a barricade against the consideration that parts of the Gospels might be the result of legendary development. So perhaps it's pertinent to examine what A. N. Sherwin White actually said, since apparently he's the end-all be-all for Christian apologists in this regard. The famous quote from A. N. Sherwin White that is utilized comes from a series of lectures of his from the 1960s that was collected and published as Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. The relevant quote is stated thus: Herodotus enables us to test the tempo of myth-making, and the test suggests that even 2 generations are too short a span to allow the mythical tendency to prevail over the hard historic core of the oral tradition. Some preliminary comments are in order. First, contrary to Strobel's imagination, A. N. Sherwin White never engaged in any sort of meticulous study that systematically calculated the rate at which legend accrued in the ancient world. In fact, in Sherwin White's book just quoted from, he makes it clear on page 186 that his considerations are brief and very general. Second, Sherwin White's quote-unquote study surveyed only one ancient writer, namely that of Herodotus. It seems incredibly hasty to make broad generalizations about anthropology in the ancient world based on the brief and general survey of one ancient historian. Third, and more importantly, Sherwin White's inferences are not about how fast myth and legend can grow, but rather how fast myth and legend can displace the historical core of a tradition. That's an important distinction, and one that we'll return to in this video. So let's survey various instances of fast-growing myths and legends and see how Sherwin White's thesis is applicable. In fact, we'll survey fast-growing legends from even more modern periods, and if we can find modern examples that cast doubt on Sherwin White's thesis, how much more doubt is cast when the thesis is applied to the ancient world, where legend and myth were the norm. Let's begin our survey with the case of Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian emperor from 1930 to 1974. Selassie's story is the strange product of rapid legendary development occurring literally overnight. You see, a political activist named Marcus Garvey was regarded as a prophet by the Rastafarian movement, a 20th century religion with Abrahamic roots. Marcus Garvey articulated the following prophecy: Look to Africa, where a black king shall be crowned. He shall be the Redeemer. Thus, as the Rastafarians were anxiously awaiting the enthronement of a black king as the would-be Messiah, who should satisfy this prophecy but Haile Selassie? Selassie was sworn in as Emperor of Ethiopia, and the legends instantly began developing. Selassie was believed to be, by the Rastafarians, God incarnate and the second coming of Jesus. This belief arose immediately upon the news of Selassie's coronation. He was instantly taken to be the Messiah who would lead the people of Africa to freedom. Other beliefs that were hoisted on Selassie by the Rastafarians were the beliefs that he hailed from the lineage of King Solomon and that he was supposedly guarding the Ark of the Covenant. These legends strongly prevailed for the entirety of Selassie's reign, 44 years. This, despite the fact that Selassie never promulgated any of these proclamations about himself. He never once claimed to be God or the Messiah. These legends grew on their own from the seed of a religious movement that Selassie was wholly indifferent to. And not only did the legends grow apart from Selassie himself, they grew in Jamaica while Selassie was in Ethiopia, but they grew extremely quickly. The story of Haile Selassie in and of itself demonstrates just how quickly anthropological factors surrounding religious movements can cause legends to take hold. Now, does this example refute A. N. Sherwin White's thesis along with his Christian apologist admirers? Well, not quite, for the very reason that despite the fictitious beliefs and cultic following of the Rastafarian religion, the historical core of Selassie's story was not displaced. In fact, part of the whole reason we know that Selassie's story is not to be found in the legends that bear his name is primarily because his factual historical story remains. Is A. N. Sherwin White's thesis vindicated then? Well, not exactly. Observe that the reason the legends surrounding Selassie were unable to unseat the authentic history of his life is primarily because Selassie was a recognized world leader. The details of Selassie's life were known internationally and were extremely unlikely to be dispelled by a small religious movement in a completely different country. And this brings us to an important shortcoming of Sherwin White's thesis. The less widespread the facts of a movement or individual are, the easier it is to displace those facts in the first place. This is a nuance that Sherwin White doesn't consider. Because the facts surrounding Selassie's life were prevalent across the globe, those facts are largely impossible to eradicate, especially at the hands of a much smaller legend that has nowhere near the reach. Conversely, if legends quickly surround a figure that is not well known outside their immediate cultural backdrop, and this legend reverberates past that backdrop, the legend very likely will eclipse, or at the very least will significantly taint, the historical core of the tradition. Let's continue our survey of fast-growing legends in order to demonstrate this. Let's examine the case of Swami Narayan. Swami Narayan was a Hindu yogi and ascetic from the 18th century. Even as a child, he was seen as spectacular. Tales abound of Swami Narayan taming wild animals, and of one instance of him miraculously reviving a dead fish. He was also said to have debated scholars on the Hindu scriptures by age 7, because he had already mastered them. At age 11, Swami Narayan embarked on a 7-year, 12,000-kilometer journey across India. During this time, he was said to walk on water and supposedly performed a miraculous healing of an ailment of King Rana Bahadur Shah. As Swami Narayan began to gain a following, his miracles grew in number and in grandeur. He began to heal the sick on a frequent basis, and at some point, he revealed his divinity to a group of his followers. He was eventually taken to be the incarnation of Krishna himself and founded his own sect of Hinduism. As a quick aside here, some might want to simply claim that Swami Narayan's story is just a copy of the Jesus tradition, since the two share so many similarities. First, in Swami Narayan's region in India, there was no known presence of Christian culture or Christian missionaries, so there's no mode of influence that could be uncovered presently. There are also no scholars today who believe that Christian tradition played any role in Swami Narayan's story. Second, even if Christian tradition did play a role, this wouldn't demonstrate anything other than the fact that legends can easily grow out of preceding cultures and parallel movements. Now, we do in fact have writings from Swami Narayan himself, but his writings are not autobiographical. The actual biographies of Swami Narayan's life, where we survey all of his aforementioned miracles and deeds, come from a handful of disciples of his who wrote during the end of his life and directly after his death. We don't have any secular biographies of his life, precisely because his movement was located in a small region of India. Now, given what we know about Swami Narayan's story, we have here a case of legend and myth completely saturating the historical tradition tied to this specific individual. And the legend and myth, contrary to A. N. Sherwin White's thesis, did not take 2 generations to overshadow the historical core. The historical core was displaced before Swami Narayan even died. And it's clear why this is the case. Swami Narayan was not well known outside of his devoted following in his small region of India. The only traditions handed down regarding his life are from those who legendized him to begin with. Thus, we see that Sherwin White's thesis is simply not applicable to a case like Swami Narayan's. The pertinent question to ask at this point is the following: is Sherwin White's thesis applicable to the Jesus tradition? That is to say, is the Jesus tradition anthropologically more in line with the story of Haile Selassie, which follows suit with Sherwin White's thesis, or is it more in line with Swami Narayan's, which contradicts it? The answer appears unambiguous. Jesus was an itinerant Jewish preacher from the small region of Galilee during the 1st century CE. His ministry was exclusive to the Judean province, which was itself a tiny fraction of the Roman Empire, and his activities were largely centered in rural villages and small towns. While Jesus had a fervent following, he wasn't exactly well known outside these regions and remained virtually unrenowned in the broader Mediterranean during his ministry. Moreover, it was only after Jesus' death that the tradition that bears his name began to reverberate beyond the regions of Judea and into neighboring Roman provinces. And during this time, his tradition gained the largest foothold among Gentiles, who most assuredly would not have had prior knowledge concerning his story. This made it all the more possible and plausible that any legend surrounding Jesus could overshadow parts of the historical core, precisely because the regions of the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean where the tradition spread would not have had knowledge of the historical core to begin with. What we see here, then, is that A. N. Sherwin White's thesis that apologists fervently champion is not applicable to the Jesus tradition. As we saw with Swaminarayan, less than 2 generations is plenty of time for a historical tradition to be legendized beyond all recognition, precisely when the tradition itself is not widely known. And this inference fits snugly within the Jesus tradition. So, is it possible that, despite Sherwin White's thesis, legendary embellishment displaced aspects of the historical core of the Jesus tradition in less than 2 generations? Indeed. In fact, not only is it possible, but it's extremely likely that this is what took place. Charismatic religious leaders like Jesus and Swaminarayan are breeding grounds for devoted religious adherents to legendize and mythologize. And given that the Jesus tradition bears a multitude of resemblances to legends of its time, it's only reasonable to infer that the Jesus tradition has been tainted by legendary development. It's important to note that I don't believe the Jesus tradition is complete legend. I do believe there remains remnants of a historical core. Nevertheless, it would seem to strain credulity to believe that this tradition has not been significantly overshadowed by legend and folklore. What we've seen then is that the rapid growth of myths surrounding figures who are not widely known beyond their immediate cultural context, as seen in both the Jesus tradition and in the case of Swaminarayan, demonstrates that less than 2 generations is ample time for legend to overshadow historical truth. A. N. Sherwin White's thesis, often championed by Christian apologists, fails to account for the unique anthropological and sociological factors that allow religious movements to quickly embellish their founders' stories, particularly when those stories spread to audiences unfamiliar with the historical figure. While the Gospels likely preserve elements of a historical Jesus, their miraculous and extraordinary claims align closely with the legendary tendencies of their time, making it not only plausible, but highly likely that significant portions of the narratives have been shaped by myth. The Jesus we encounter in the Gospels is likely a mixture of the theological and the historical, and these two are not the same. Thanks for watching.